Hi there, grief growers. Before we begin, just a quick note to let you know that I'm going off the air for the month of December to grieve the loss of my mom, who died on December 26th, 2013. I'll be releasing episodes of Grief Book Roundup again in January. In the meantime, you can always find more grief support resources, including podcast episodes, blog posts, and videos at shelbyforsythia.com. Grief is hard, but getting good grief support doesn't have to be. That's why I love text-based grief support from Grief Coach. For less than the price of an hour's therapy, Grief Coach sends you thoughtful tips and resources about life after loss all year long. Texts are curated by grief experts and authors and can be customized based on relationship, cause of death, and more. You also receive personalized texts for grief anniversaries and special days, and extra support around the holiday season. And if you have friends or family members who want to help you grieve but aren't sure how, you can add them to your subscription and Grief Coach will text them grief support tips and reminders of your important dates, because no one should ever have to grieve alone. Sign up for Grief Coach's text-based grief support today at grief.coach/shelbyforsythia. You can find a link in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Grief Book Roundup, a podcast where I introduce you to a grief book I love in 10 minutes or less. I'm Shelby Forsythia, an intuitive grief guide and author who helps grieving people come back to life after devastating loss. My mom's death in 2013 made me a student of grief, and I'm perpetually reading books related to loss, transformation, and finding your way after everything falls apart. Here, I'll share them with you. On Grief Book Roundup, I'll introduce you to grief books new and old, highlight marginalized authors and underrepresented grief stories, and remind you in whatever loss you're facing, you are not alone. Let's get to today's book. Hi there, grief growers, and thanks so much for joining me today on Grief Book Roundup. Today I am bringing you a book called Between Two Kingdoms by Suleika Jaouad. Having read and continuing to read a great deal of grief memoirs, I am super familiar with stories of losing a loved one to cancer. But Between Two Kingdoms is a memoir of a person with cancer. Suleika Jaouad, who is the writer of the Emmy Award-winning New York Times column Life Interrupted, shares in this book, often with graphic and heart-wrenching detail, her experience being diagnosed with leukemia in her early 20s, being given a 35% chance at surviving, and what she does with her life and her re-entry after going into remission almost 4 years later. To be clear, Between Two Kingdoms is not a book about being sick and then being cured, a crisp before and after story. It is a constant turning over of a life lived in the world of between sick and well, between griever and the one who is grieved, between old and new, and between past and future. If I had to pick 3 words to describe this book, they would be complicated, brutal, and interior. Complicated because Jaouad is intent, almost like a hunting dog, or like someone on a detective sleuthing mission, to pick up and put down all of the pieces that a thing is connected to. What does it mean to be diagnosed with something? What about the phrase move on? Where does that come from? How does that exist in our lives? How do other people see it? The amount of questions that Jaouad asks about her own life, how other people do things, how the world sees things, how she could possibly see things, is intense and unrelenting. And every single chapter in this book is filled with layer upon layer upon layer. So if you are somebody who really appreciates when people show up and tell the truth about a thing, the whole truth about a thing, you will really appreciate this book. The second word I chose is brutal, because this book is graphic. There are scenes and stories involving needles and blood and a lack of privacy and a lack of dignity and vomiting and just the reality, the behind closed doors behind the scrubbed clean news anchor stories of surviving cancer, this is what it's really like to experience and endure this. It feels a little bit like Jaouad has drawn the curtain back, but not in a way that's revealing for a performance aspect, but revealing again for this truth-telling aspect. And sometimes the truth is brutal. And interior, because this is a memoir, of course, you're getting Jaouad's perspective throughout, and the depths that she plumbs, the extents to which she is willing to go to not only ask questions, but to get those questions answered, or to try to answer those questions, is unending. It feels very much as if her head is never empty. There's always something she's chewing on in there. And as she is narrating the outer experiences of her life, the people she's interacting with, the experiences that are happening on and to her body, she is also pairing those beautifully with the internal dialogue that is constantly running inside of her head. And Between Two Kingdoms is a marvelous marriage and picture of that. In terms of losses included in the book, Suleika Jaouad hones in on a vast array of losses, including health, privacy, dignity, the loss of her fertility, past, future, and frankly just normalcy, how life is, quote, supposed to go. I really appreciated too that she spends several chapters examining how partnership, romance, breakups, and sexual intimacy are complicated by cancer and by grief, and these are topics on which many books on loss are silent. Some of my favorite quotes from the book include this one from chapter 14. Jaouad writes, "When you are facing the possibility of imminent death, people treat you differently. Their gaze lingers, recording each mole, tracing the shape of your lips, noting the exact shade of your eyes, as if they are painting a portrait of you to hang in memory's gallery. They take dozens of pictures and videos of you on their phones, trying to freeze frame time, to bottle the sound of your laugh, to immortalize meaningful moments that can later be revisited in a memory cloud. All of this attention can feel like you are being memorialized while you are still alive." And something about that quote just haunted me, to understand perhaps for the first time what it's like to be the person who is ill, as opposed to the person accompanying the ill person. This line, it can be like you are memorialized while you are still alive, as Jaouad was witnessing people beginning to grieve her as she was sitting there in front of them. A wild and heartbreaking and totally surreal experience. The next quote I love comes from chapter 27. She's speaking to a friend named Ned, who has also endured a hard and long illness. "Ned has just summed up what's taken me almost a year to untangle for myself. There is no restitution for people like us. No return to days when our bodies were unscathed, our innocence intact. Recovery isn't a gentle self-care spree that restores you to a pre-illness state. Though the word may suggest otherwise, recovery is not about salvaging the old at all. It's about accepting you must forsake a familiar self forever in favor of one that is being newly born. It is an act of brute, terrifying discovery." So griefgoers, if you are looking for a book that tells the truth about cancer and illness from one woman's perspective, and yet also wires in these universal truths about what it means to be sick, what it means to be well, and straddling the space between those two worlds, I think Between Two Kingdoms would make the perfect book for you to read next. Thank you so much for joining me today on Grief Book Roundup. You can find a link to buy today's book in the show notes for this episode. If you'd like to submit a grief book for the show or buy one of my books on grief, visit shelbyforsythia.com. You can follow me on social media at shelbyforsythia on Facebook and Instagram. If this podcast helped you find your next great grief read, be sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And if someone in your life has experienced a loss, be sure to share this show with them, especially if they love to read. I'm able to purchase grief books and keep this podcast on the air thanks to my amazing Patreon supporters. If you'd like to support Grief Book Roundup on Patreon through a yearly or monthly pledge and access live grief support calls and workshops hosted by yours truly, visit patreon.com/ShelbyForsythia. Music for Grief Book Roundup is performed by Owen Phillips. Until next time, I see you. I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world. And I love you. Because even through grief, we are growing.